So a big welcome to everyone today to this forum session. Great to see that you're able to make it to the forum today. With this class, we have sought to lighten the load by putting up videos of last semester or previous semester classes. Hands up those who've been able to watch some of the videos of week 1, week 2. So you'll be able to watch some of those videos and see the classes from week 1 and week 2. So I encourage you to do that. In the video from week 1, the first video, about half of the video is an introduction to this subject, and then the other half of the video starts to talk about critical thinking. So I encourage you, if you can, to go to the Moodle page, and then under the Moodle page, and your Moodle page may look different to mine, and then under the Moodle page, you've got the discussion threads where we go to each week, and then you've got the subjects that we cover each week. And then under topic 1, under the tile, there should be information about topic 1. You've still got the recordings of the intensives if you want to go back and watch the intensives. So there's the recordings there, which you can find very valuable and useful. And then, as well as the recordings of the intensive, you've got the videos that we want you to watch for each week. So topic 1, what is critical thinking, for this week of the 9th to the 14th of August. Please watch the video introduction to the subject. And then in this video introduction to the subject, you'll see an introduction there. And the reason we've put it on the video is so that you can fit this into your time schedule. You can stop and start it. You can skip over sections. You can go backwards and forwards. And so there's a couple of 1-hour videos there that introduce the subject and the assessment items. And then partway through the video, it goes on to a discussion of critical thinking, which is what I'm wanting to move on to today. So that's the first of a couple of videos. There's another video here on the aims and objectives for this subject. There's another video that I've put up on the difference between education and indoctrination. And so one of the important discussions under critical thinking in this 30-minute video is the difference between education and indoctrination, where we tell students what to think, whereas with education, we encourage students to question and to ask big questions. And even over the last 100 years, there's been a move from indoctrination and telling students what to think to encouraging students to ask questions. And this can be a challenge in that parents may not always like their children to ask questions. And then there's another video for this first week on thinking beyond weak assumptions. So again, I encourage you to watch that video there. So you've got a bit of flexibility as to how much time you put into watching these videos. You've got the flexibility to skip through the videos. You've got the flexibility to stop and start there. So let me know if there's any challenges or difficulties with those resources. Let me know. It's always a challenge to balance whether you are given too many resources or too few resources. So we've got to try and balance that as well. So any questions about that, hands up? Otherwise, we'll make a start And in the first video, after the introduction, there's a Bible reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul writes to the church that he values their approach to thinking, but in Corinth and in Athens and in Greece, with their emphasis on wisdom, he finds that there is a problem. And so Paul writes that the wisdom of this world can be foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, God catches the wise in their craftiness and pride, and the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise. At times they can be futile, and there should be no boasting about human leaders and human ideas. Following Christ, we should be humble and open to God's revelation to us. So there's some great insights there into the nature of Christian approaches to wisdom and thinking. That is, it should be humble. It should be aware of the bigness of God and the world and the universe and knowledge, and that we need to be careful about rushing quickly into claiming that we are wise, and that using boasting or human ideas and motivations can get us into trouble. And then there's a prayer by Thomas Aquinas on this first video. And Thomas Aquinas prays, "My dense intellect, I pray, regarding dissipating darkness that covers me, sin and ignorance, grant me, Lord God, a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, and ease in learning, and lucidity to comprehend, an abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work." And so it's a prayer that can apply to us today. And so Thomas Aquinas, 1,000 years ago, University of Paris, could be quoted there. Just as a passing comment, I'm in France at the moment, so our video is from France, and I've just been past the University of Paris, and where Thomas Aquinas was teaching in the last few days. So just a passing comment. But the wonders of Zoom and technology. So today's class, we're looking at critical thinking, what's meant by critical thinking, and why it's important for effective learning. So let's begin by asking a few students what you mean by critical thinking. So let's start with Amy, and then Libby, and then Hannah. What do you think is meant by critical thinking? And we could also ask why it's important, why this subject, this approach is important. And this relates to Forum 1 that we'll come and discuss in a moment, where it looks at critical thinking in the classroom and says that it's so important. But Amy, what's critical thinking? Why is it important? Amy?
I'm just having a moment to wrap my head around everything again.
Yes.
Yeah, I think critical thinking is the ability to process our own thoughts, gain new knowledge, and reflect on it. I think that was something that stood out to me through the intensives, was the importance of reflection as we assimilate more knowledge over time, whether that's through that whole tripod example of having a few different points of views, but always collating it back to what we actually believe as well, to have a standpoint and not lose our own also like views, otherwise we can get a little bit scattered. I think I don't know how much you want me to say. I can stop there.
That sounds good. So I like what you say. So it's reflecting on not only knowledge, but ways we know. And also I like what you say about being aware of different points of view, but also like the way you add that you then land your knowledge again and come back to, what do you believe? What are you committed to? Why is it important? So I like those stages. It's not only about knowledge. So you gather knowledge, you can go to the internet or the library, encyclopedia, but it reflects on, and I like what you say about reflecting on ways we know, different viewpoints rather than one viewpoint, and then it comes back to what we believe and why. So thanks, Amy, that's terrific. Libby, what are your thoughts on what critical thinking is and why it's important?
Something growing up is I felt like I haven't been a very good critical thinker. I think I've been, what you were saying before, indoctrinated into this is what you believe and why. So for me, it is taking that a step further and actually really taking the time to think for myself and to learn from just, I suppose, reading more critically, learning from the historians like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and also wisdom from the Bible. And there's so much to learn from the people in the Bible. And from observing nature, so looking at God's creation and seeing for ourselves. So using critical thinking as in scientific skills by doing the observing and analysing and researching for ourselves and what we think. And I suppose I agree with what Amy was saying with working out what we believe and why we believe. I think that's really important too.
I like those stages that you mentioned. And you mentioned learning to think for ourselves, which can be contrasted with following the thinking of others. And I think in our life journey, we're always following others to some extent, our parents, but from a young age, we're asking the question, why mum, why dad? And so we're thinking for ourselves. And then some mums and dads will try and squeeze that out of us and say, you don't need to know why, just follow and do. And so as teachers, we shouldn't be just saying, just listen. We should be giving them an opportunity to ask questions. I like the way you say that reading more critically. So there's a vast amount of information. One of the things we want to do in this subject is introduce you more fully to 2,000 years of writing. And so you can go online and you can read the original writings of Aristotle, and we've shown you how you can do that. And you can Google the original writings of Aristotle online, free. If you Google those words into Google, you'll find that you can read Aristotle's writings, you can read Plato's writings, and then on through history, you can read the writings of many thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas. You can read his writings, Martin Luther, John Wesley, all the way up to our present time, and you can read Piaget's original writings and others as well. I like the way you mentioned the Bible, and one of the challenges we'll touch on in this subject in week 3 is a topic called hermeneutics, which is how we read and interpret Bible. And so each of the books of the Bible has a slightly different genre. So if you read the book of Samuel, it's more of a narrative, a story of Samuel the prophet and Kings Saul, David, and Solomon. And that's quite different to Proverbs as a genre, which is different to Psalms as a genre, which is different to prophecy, which is different to the book of Revelation and to the Gospels. So there's different books and different ways of reading those books. But the powerful thing is that God speaks through the Bible. And I find that a fascinating question, how God does speak through the Bible, because when you read the Bible, you can find that it's a living word to you, and that the Spirit of God brings it alive, and that there are all sorts of thoughts and ideas come into your mind, and you have to evaluate and respond to those. So I think the ways in which God's word, the Bible, speaks to us is very important. And then hands up those who have a more Catholic tradition. And so those who come from a more Catholic tradition, there are huge traditions that can speak to you as well. And hands up those who feel God could speak through a statue of Mary or through other ways. So here in France, God can speak through statues and other ways. Before Notre Dame caught fire, we went into Notre Dame, and you can even find there's one side of Notre Dame Cathedral where they've got possibly nails from Jesus on the cross and possibly blood from Jesus on the cross. And my wife, who's a good Presbyterian, said, "We don't believe that, Sam. We're Protestants." And then there are others who would say, from a Catholic perspective, we believe. And so this raises all sorts of questions. So we won't go into that huge debate, but we realise that tradition, God could speak through the church and church leaders, and Protestants would, if you're a Martin Luther Lutheran, you would say God can speak to you through Luther and his writings. If you're a Methodist, you could say God could speak through John Wesley and his writings. So you've got to make decisions about tradition. So I've gone on for a long time on that. You've mentioned, Libby, nature and God's creation. Alistair McGrath at Oxford at the moment is writing books. So Alistair McGrath at Oxford is writing books on natural theology. And in these books, he says that God speaks to us through the natural world. And if you observe the natural world, you can, the goodness of God can be seen in the goodness that's in the world. And the brokenness of the world can be seen in the world around us. You can see sin and you can understand sin, and then redemption. Perhaps we need the Bible to help us to understand. We need Jesus to help us understand redemption and salvation more fully than natural theology might reveal to us. But if you see a butterfly, that is, a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, you can see the miracle of transformation. And so natural theology speaks to that. By way of contrast, we have scientific approaches, and the philosopher Aristotle in Greece argued observe and analyze, whereas Plato said reflect more, and you don't just know by observing and analysing, you need to think and you need to reason, because maths is not just about observing, maths is about reasoning, and that God has not only established what we can observe and analyse and given us a mental ability for that, God has also, says Plato, given us a capacity to think and reason and maths. And so there's two different Greek traditions there, I feel. One is the scientific tradition of Aristotle, and if you then have to make a choice between Aristotle and the scientific tradition and Plato and the reasoning tradition, then I think the answer is both. So realise there's both. And if you have to make a choice between the Calvinist position that God set things in place and we use reason to understand, like Scottish Calvinists or European Calvinists, and a more Methodist Pentecostal approach, the Spirit leads us, then I think the answer is both. And that way everyone's included. And so in your classroom, both could be an answer to that choice. And then we went on, reflect why we believe what we believe, important there. So Libby, a long response to your great thoughts there. Hannah, what are your thoughts on critical thinking? What's it involve? And yeah.
Yeah, so I actually quite like a lot of the points that Amy and Libby have also said about critical thinking. I see it kind of as being able to observe and analyse the world we live in, and also put ourselves in other people's shoes. If we know where other people are coming from as well, to be able to inform our decision. And like Amy said, you get exposed to multiple views. You also get exposed to lots of more information, and that you can then collate and decide which one you're going to believe and ground it back in your own belief. And then through that, the kids and we can all actually just work better in our day-to-day life. If we just always assume we're right and don't actually look anywhere else, we're not really going to grow as people. And and like the way we teach it to the kids is we're trying to teach them how to be able to, like working with the 3 to 5 year olds, teaching them critical thinking. We're trying to teach them the process of looking at everything in the situation, not just what they can see, that then they can then go, oh, so this person's feeling upset because of this. This is what I think. How can we solve the problem? And so then actually then getting it from the thinking thought into actually putting it into practice and actions with showing our belief or solving the problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so good. So thank you for that, Hannah. Let's ask Bridget and Mauricia, and perhaps we can move on a bit further too. Bridget and Mauricia, how do we apply this in the classroom? One of the interesting statements in one of the forums was that Piaget says you don't critically think until you're 11 years of age, whereas I think the prep teachers here would say even if you're 2 or 3 years of age, there's a certain level of critical thinking. It's just a different approach to it. And even if you're 70 or 80 or 90 years of age, you're probably just stumbling along and accepting things that you're not critically thinking about. So perhaps there's a challenge from to the whole Piaget idea. Piaget certainly has brilliant insights into the ways in which our capacity for critical thinking changes through the years, but at the same time, critical thinking is probably happening at every year level. So Bridget and then Mauricia, what are your thoughts on the nature of critical thinking and how we teach it?
Yeah, I actually like what you said then. I did read a lot about that, and I quoted in my discussion thread that from 11 years old, like critical thinking starts. But actually, you know, when you really think about it, I've got a 4-year-old that thinks a lot, and she can really relate in the critical thinking environment. And I was like, you know, it's actually true, you know, they can think from a lot of different ages. And I went back and I reread it and read a bit more onto that, and it actually does go deep, and they do think at an early age. And I really agree with that statement that you said, Sam. And yeah, I think applying it to our kids is, again, just asking questions, getting them to think outside of the box and letting them ask questions about what you're teaching and what you're thinking, as well as teachers in the classroom.
And this raises the one of the points that we're looking at with week 2, the Greeks, and you'll see that there's notes there, and we covered it in the intensive, and there's video under week 2 that you can look at further on that as well from the previous class on asking questions. And so important to ask questions in the classroom and create space. This raises the question about what are good questions. And they encourage students to dig a bit deeper. And you can tell a story like Snow White, and then you can ask, you know, what's being portrayed here with someone eating an apple? You know, are there temptations? Are we always aware? You know, someone offers us an apple. What happened if someone offered us something that was not good for us? You know, would we know? So I think asking questions is so important there as well. Mauricia, your thoughts on critical thinking and on ways we teach it?
I'm having a bit of a brain fog moment of which readings relate to which subject I'm doing, but I like the idea of allowing, like, to relate it to, say, you know, teaching in the classroom, allowing your students to be in a space in which they can explore and be open to that. So, you know, no question, that, like, it's a bit of a throwaway comment when people say no question is silly, but actually really making the space like that, like ask all the questions, and then sometimes you might not be able to answer it right then, and then even in that have the humility to say, oh, you know, that's awesome, I don't actually know the answer to that, let's write that down and we're going to come back to it later. Or so that way it just gets them in this mindset of it's okay to be curious about everything.
Yeah, so good. I love what you say there, Mauricia, about a safe space for questions. And it's so easy to close one another down. And it's so easy to allow other students to close one another down. So I think great to have a safe space there. And we have to be careful of some students dominate. And so one of the things you can do is you can have a rule in your class that every student has to have a chance to speak once before a student can speak a second time. Sometimes people will pass around a baton or something like that. It's the speaker holds that and others shouldn't criticise. But one of the things that we're seeking to encourage in this subject is classrooms that have safe space for asking questions. And we're saying that that's a very healthy educational approach to have a safe space for asking questions. And this is a particular type of education which could be quite different to 100 years ago in 1800, where the teacher stood at the front and gave you the cane if you disobeyed, etc. And the classic example I've mentioned in a previous class is Peter Sculthorpe, who went to the same primary school that I went to in St Leonard's in Tasmania. And he had his first piano lesson, and he was so excited he went home and he started composing piano pieces and writing it on paper, and he got the cane when he went back next week, because that's not what piano was about. It was about practicing, not this silly thing called composing. And he went on to become one of Australia's great musical composers, Peter Sculthorpe. But it was closed down in that sort of 1800s. Close the students down. We don't want too much of this thinking. So we'll always have one or two students who know the answer, and we've got to acknowledge them, but at the same time, we don't want them to dominate. And one of the challenges is that we've got to allow and encourage every student. Let's ask Leonie and then Olivia. What are your thoughts on critical thinking, how we can teach it, and then moving on to this idea of Socrates? That is, Socratic thinking is that often questions can be better than answers. That is, answers can close down the discussion, whereas questions can encourage expression, ownership, further questioning, and deeper examination. And in your essays, when you come to your essays, one of the things that we're going to ask you to do is to think deeper. And to do that, you might ask questions. So Leonie and then Olivia, what are we doing in critical thinking, and how in the classroom can we use questions to encourage people to think more deeply? Leonie.
So to me, critical thinking is not just random thoughts. It is thinking deeply and thinking with a purpose. And then I think a way that we can encourage this in the classroom is not only allowing the students to ask questions, but also posing a question to the students that that gets the gears turning. So yeah.
Yeah, I like that. So we're encouraging the students to have the freedom and the safe place to ask questions, but as teachers, we're posing questions that get the wheels turning. So that is terrific. Olivia, your thoughts?
My thoughts of being in the classroom, I sort of like used this the other day. They were doing some time in the classroom, and I kept asking a question. They asked me a question, but then I would answer them with a question. And it was quite interesting because they sort of like looked at me as if to go, but you should know that. And I'm like, but I don't know that. So it was quite just, I mean, the little boy was in year, the children, sorry, were in year 2. So they just automatically thought, hang on a minute, why are you asking me? So just give them ownership of their own learning.
I like what you say there, Olivia, about admitting we as teachers don't know it all. And I guess there comes a stage with parents when our mum and our dad, we admit, you don't know it all. And so I think that's so very, very valuable. Janelle and then Tiffany, critical thinking, using questions and critical thinking in the classroom. What have you found? And even from our work with our posts in the forum, we're looking at this. Yeah. Janelle and then Tiffany.
I just think a lot of it's just compiling information. I love brainstorming and mapping, getting everyone's ideas, and then just adding on to that all the time. So continually asking, like, these were our ideas. How did we come up with that? Where did we get that from? You know, just playing off that. I think analysing that, not just doing the mind map and leaving it there, but to actually analyse it and communicate that with the kids. I think that's one of the main things with critical thinking, is to constantly keep your open mind and give them those problem solving activities, just to keep them thinking as well, I think. So.
And you mentioned the mind mapping, which is really good. And in the Zoom, there is the article in that post on mind mapping. And so in the first forum post, it talks about mapping. And I think you introduced that really well, Janelle, is the value of drawing up a mind map. And you can do that on the whiteboard or the blackboard, and you can say, let's do a mind map of what we're looking at here, and how we're going to gather the information, where can we get the information from? And it could be about the weather. And is it going to rain today? What are the sources of information? How are we going to critically analyse it? Where does the weather station get its information from? How often are they right? How do we respond? Is it going to be a wet day or a dry day? How do we respond to the different weather events that come along? Tiffany, what are your thoughts on critical thinking and how we teach it?
I think everyone's points have kind of covered a lot of it, but I think that, acknowledging the children's questions. So we might ask a question and answer it with a question, but then answering that question as well. So we do want to give the kids an answer, maybe not a definitive answer, but something that they can go and then think on. And they may, we might give them an answer to their question before lunch, and they might go stew on it and come back and say, well, no, I don't think that. I don't think that answer was right. And I think that's really important to then take that on as teachers and be like, okay, let's explore that.
Yeah, so good. So don't always rush to the answer. Give time to work with the answers is so important. Matilda and Karen. So Matilda and then Karen.
I think that it's so important for, critical teaching to be taught, and teaching kids, actually teaching them how to ask questions on their own as well. So not just posing questions to them, but also being like, well, what are some questions that you have about this as well? Because I think it not only stems into their learning, makes them, I think, more obviously effective learners, but it teaches them about themselves and their own ways of thinking, and going out into the world after that. They can think more deeply about what's going on around them, question what they actually believe, and, things that happen and why they think those things happen. So I think teaching it in the classroom allows them to then stem out in the real world and use that and go, oh, okay, well, we did this in class today, and I've seen something happen today that I actually would like to think on a little more and ask questions about. So, yeah.
Yeah, love it. That's so well said and put together. Karen, your thoughts, critical thinking and its teaching and questions. Yeah, does it work for you?
Her microphone
is not working, so we've seen it there, so that's good. And then Rachel,
She's been
just
popping
a
lots of
sentence or
things
two.
in the chat.
Yeah, brilliant. So thank you. And Rachel, thought or two, but briefly, just a sentence or two. Yep.
Yeah, just agree with everyone else, but like Tiffany was saying, I like to ask my kids why, but then if they're struggling to find an answer, I either answer the question on like a basic level and then go, okay, let's expand on this all together in the classroom, because sometimes they sit there and they give the basic answers and we want a little bit more deep from them. And so we ask them why is that? Why do you think that?
So good. Now, one of the ways that you can ensure that more students get a chance to ask questions is to do the pair share approach. That is, talk to the student next to you, ask a question of the student next to you, and that way you've got 50% of the class thinking, sharing, rather than just one person dominating as well. So there's some of the things that we covered. Now, when it comes to the forums, a couple of questions in regards to the forum posts. So one of the questions I'd like to ask is Peter Ellerton's article, to think critically, to communicate clearly, to solve complex problems for Forum 1, can be more important than an undergraduate major. Is this article the sort of article that you would quote in assignment 2 or 3, and why? So Forum Post 1. So Forum Post 1, you're interacting with Peter Ellerton's resource there. And my answer to this question would be, firstly, maybe we'll ask Rachel and then Libby. Would you use it? And maybe two sides of the coin. Why would you use it? Why would you not use it in your assignment as a scholarly article or not a scholarly article? Rachel first, would you use the Forum 1 post article by Peter Ellerton in your assignment, yes or no? And both sides of the coin, perhaps.
I think you could potentially use it. I think one of the benefits is it takes a lot of points, like intelligence, is like school smarts is measured by our IQ tests, whereas like that's all that matters. So I think it's got some places that you can jump off from, but on the other side of the corner, I don't think you could use it like purely by itself in probably like a whole paragraph of your assessment. I think, like I said, it's a jumping point. So it's great to use as a jumping point, but can't be used within like a whole paragraph or as just one basis of a side in your essay in the paragraph, that you can't just, this is all I'm going to use, or just use the basis from it, if that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely. So one of the weaknesses of his article, he mentions IQ tests, but he doesn't define IQ tests. He doesn't go into the history of IQ tests. The other thing that we find is that there's no references at the end, so we don't know where he gathers his information from. And so there are some weaknesses in using this article in an essay, whereas if you would go to Google Scholar, or if you were to go to the Alpha Crucis library online resources, then you would find stronger articles that might have 100 references or 20 references at the end of them. The strength of it is that you know that he is a PhD qualified scholar at the University of Queensland, but this particular article is not as strong. Libby, your thoughts on the use of the article or not using the article?
I'm sorry, I had a phone call and I've kind of switched off a little bit. I was just trying to quickly bring up the article now because I I haven't remembered very much about it, to be honest. And I've been through a lot the last 2 weeks, so I need to refresh my brain.
Yeah, no, sounds good. And then we've got Marissa is saying the study that it mentions, it would be good to go and look at more detail and then possibly use the original source. So I think that's a good point, is that often an article will quote other scholars, will quote a study. And so I think both of you, Rachel and Libby, you've given some of the reasons there. Hands up someone else who's got a thought on whether you'd use this or not use it. I think on the whole, it's probably not one of the strongest of articles, but boy, it's useful for you in that it gives you ideas. It's very comprehensible, digestible, but it raises questions that you can explore further, such as questions about IQ. So it's useful. It raises the question, intelligence, can it be measured by IQ tests? The ability to evaluate own thinking. I really like this list of values of inquiry, and you could actually Google that further, couldn't you? You could look at values of inquiry, and you could go to another resource, Google. You could do a search on values of inquiry, and then if you went to Google Scholar, you could actually find more on that. So I think that is useful. He then raises the question, the temperature of the planet is increasing, so there's an important one. Perhaps it's one of the big issues of our time. So if you want an issue of our time to discuss, then the temperature of our planet increasing is one of the big issues of our time. Some have said the bigger issue of our time is deforestation. So the problem's not just that the temperature of the Earth has increased by about 1 degree over the last 100 years, even over the last 30 years. But one of the reasons that it's increased is that we've chopped down a lot of the trees. So deforestation is probably one of the big problems. And at the moment in the Amazon in South America, there's a huge amount of tree clearing going on, which is, it's a bit like removing the lungs of a person. I know someone who's had an operation and had part of their lungs removed, and you don't have as much capacity when that happens. And when you chop down the trees of the earth, then there's not as much capacity. And if you look out at the farmland around where there used to be a lot of trees, there's a lot of just bare ground, and then the wind comes along and blows the earth away. So there's a whole discussion point that he just briefly touches on. He then mentions Australia's greatest sports person. I thought that was a great example that you could use in the class as a critical thinking exercise. And so Leonie and Olivia, do you have any thoughts on Australia's greatest sports person as a discussion point? How you might use that as a discussion point there? While you're thinking, this article, it's opinionated but doesn't have detail. It doesn't answer necessarily questions relating. It may not be the strongest, but it can give us insights, and it would be good to look at some of those things touched on. So Leonie, do you have thoughts on Australia's greatest sports person as a critical thinking point?
I'm actually not sure. I mean, if your assessment handles with something like that, with the upbringing of people, but yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, if you bring it into your extensive into your training and whatever, and you think critically about that, but I don't think that could have an influence on your assessments.
Sounds good. Olivia, do you like this question? Who is Australia's greatest sports person, as a question to help stimulate critical thinking in a classroom?
No, I'm not sure either, I'll be honest.
That sounds good. So it's just one example of a question that was raised there. One of the things he goes on to say is that critical thinking should challenge assumptions. One of the dangers with this, of course, is that you don't want to leave people without any views. So every family might have views about politics. And if you challenge the assumptions of your students and say, are you right to vote Labor or right to vote Liberal, etc., what if you then leave people with the opposite view to their family? You got to ground and land the thinking again. So it is important to challenge assumptions and critical thinking, but it's also important to realise we live in real worlds, don't we? So you could challenge what pastors say in churches, but then again, you've got to go to that church next week. You could challenge what another teacher says in another class, but you've got to go to that class and relate to the teacher. So yes, we need to encourage students to challenge assumptions, but at the same time, you've got to ground it in a real lived world. Frame problems collectively. Yes, that's an excellent way to do it. But at the same time, what if some of the collective people are Adolf Hitler or someone like that? Do you take his views into account? Or there's a war going on at the moment in the Ukraine. Do you accept both sides, or do you work through the issues? Question creatively. Construct, analyse and evaluate arguments, discern and imply values of inquiry, engage cognitive skills. So there's a great list there. And then I really like that resource on argument mapping that he has there. And so if you want to explore a bit more, University of Queensland have put forward this resource here on argument mapping. And so it's worth writing up on the whiteboard or the blackboard or getting students to write on paper a map of the argument. And then UQ put forward the question about life and death, and you could ask lots of questions about that and so on. So argument mapping can be useful, and then you've got moral questions like smoking and other substances that can be challenging for people. Vaping is one of the big ones. In our schools, we've got to make a decision about vaping. And then there can be other substances. And there's examples that are given there. And then I don't think his diagram's that wonderful. If you go to mapping diagrams, then you can see the way to use colour and pictures in your mapping diagrams as well. And so I just encourage you, that's a resource. You can find the link in the forum post. Just a couple of other thoughts on the forum posts. The best forum posts are going to think a bit more deeply, and they're going to add a bit more information. Bridget Larry, on your forum post there, is this here? Let me get rid of this X. So Bridget, it's opening up things. Yes, you raised that important question there about Piaget and children thinking prior to the age of 11. We've discussed that and mentioned that. One of the thoughts my wife had was sometimes for children, you can get too much information. And so if you've got a page with too much information on, you can cut the page into smaller pieces and encourage the students to make a task much smaller. We're talking about whether there can be too much information. If you then cut the page in smaller amounts of information and scaffold it, that can be useful. So in response to Bridget, your forum post was good. It could have more references there. And Bridget, you quoted Piaget. you could have a reference to Piaget. You could quickly go to Google Scholar, Alpha Crucis Library Resource, and have a reference. Matilda, you could add references. And then Hannah, I noticed you added an extra reference with elk cats, what we can learn from Reggio Emilia, 100 languages of children there. I think when you have those extra resources, I would encourage you with the forum posts. So just mention with the forum posts, if you think more deeply, and one of the quick ways, a quick way to do this is to interact with another 2 or 3 resources. And one of the quick ways to interact with another 2 or 3 resources is to go to Google Scholar or the AC library resources. And you need a fairly quick way to read, gather information, and then include it in the forum post. And then you can quickly put the reference there. Again, you need a fairly quick way of gathering the references to the material. One of the quick ways that I have found of gathering the references, so if we go to Google Scholar, and then we do a Google Scholar search, and so and because I got Norton, it's going to send me crazy places. So Google Scholar, and then it should bring up Google Scholar. So this is quite a fast way. And then Piaget, age, asking questions. And then on the right-hand side, we can see Piaget and the teaching of history. So that could be an article here. And so down the side, you've got some material. And then you've got to make a decision in regards to that material as to whether it's going to be useful. So you go to that. So let me go down to theory. And then you've got to find a quick way of gathering the resource. So this is Saul McLeod, Piaget's Stages of Scholarly Development. You've got then to decide, is this the sort of scholarly article you're after? Again, it's not going to give you all the references at the end. It can give you information, but it's not really such a scholarly article. So perhaps you might move something like a journal. Educational research would be a better resource, and then it's going to give you the citation information. Unfortunately, you can't access this one, so that's not so useful for you there. But gives you just a brief introduction. We could go on further and think about how you access references. So one of the big questions is referencing included in the word count? No, not the referencing. And then secondly, the quotes not included in the word count. And then also check with the lecturer on the word count. In your forum posts, I would rather you went on a bit longer, 300 words rather than 200, 350 words, so on, and include a bit more information and an extra reference or 2. I think that would be useful. One of our major concerns is we don't want you spending so much time on this that you don't have time for your other subjects or for your other assignments. So be aware, unless you're only studying one subject and you've got time, allocate your time where it's most needed. And your time is most needed in putting some time into every subject. And also your time is most needed in your assessments. So make sure you put time into your major assessments. And your major assessments is for assignment 2 and assignment 3. So I encourage you to put most of your time into assignment 2 and assignment 3 there. So don't go putting huge amounts of time into your forum posts and not much time into assignment 2 and 3. It needs to be the other way around. You need to put most of your time into assignment 2 and assignment 3 because that's where you get most of your grades. So does anyone want to post onto the chat further questions you have about forum, or to raise your hand and we can answer those questions now? So I think the forum's got some very interesting insights. So I encourage you there. I was wondering if you could tell me if I'm on the right track. One of the students asked, I found Plato's allegory of the cave very interesting, the way we perceive the globe. I think that's a reasonable forum post, and it will certainly give you 5 or 6 out of 10. A stronger forum post would go on to say, scholar so-and-so has said, and even stronger, scholar A has said, scholar B has said. And this would be more in the academic tone of objective third-person writing than in the first person I found, I think. And this raises one of the real challenges that we face, is that objective third person is preferred, but at the same time, what do we do with subjective first person? And so a student and teacher asked about this yesterday, and one of the things that stood out to me is that subjective first person is so important, but it comes across so poorly in our writing, in that it sounds opinionated and it doesn't sound like you're thinking well. One solution to this is to keep a journal, and in your journal, write in the first person. Own what you write. And so if we're talking about critical thinking, we're talking about Plato's allegory of the cave, you can write a few sentences in the first person. I like Plato's allegory of the cave in that it encourages me that our observations, our thoughts might simply be observations, are often like looking at shadows. Rather than looking at the real thing. And so this is what Plato is saying, is that often what we think is the real thing is but a shadow of the real thing. In our Christian walk, we might say the real way to walk as a Christian is not get bogged down with all this reasoning, but to hear God speak to you yourself. Now, is that the real thing, or is that a shadow of the real thing? I think Plato would say that's a shadow of the real thing, in that God speaks in many ways, and that we don't need to throw out reasoning, and that reasoning is a part of the way God thinks. And yes, intuition and speaking into your spirit is important, but this doesn't get rid of reasoning. So my first statement, I was saying God just speaks to us by our spirit, reasoning's not important. That was a shadow of the reality. Getting close to the reality for Plato is that God speaks through reasoning as well. And I've written an article you may find online about the 4 ways God speaks. And this says that God speaks to us through experience, both inner experience in our thoughts, but also outer experience. So God's involved in the real world that's out there. And so we should learn from outer experience. And one of your students mentioned natural theology before. That's observing what goes on in the natural world that's out there. And when it comes to evolution and creation, our experience tells us that there's miracles of caterpillars turning to butterflies, but there are scientists who talk about evolution as well. So all this is part of experience. And then reasoning includes scholars and study, but as well as this, there is also the traditions that we're a part of, and the schools of thought that we're a part of. And as well as this, there's the Bible, which is one of the major ways that God's speaking to us. And through the Bible, we get a revelation of God, Jesus, Spirit. So these are 4 ways that God speaks to us: experience, reasoning, tradition, and Bible. And you can't avoid being a part of a tradition. That is, we're in the Western world in 2022. You're part of that tradition. You're part of the people that you mix with. So your traditions influence how God speaks. So I've tried to show there an example of digging deeper than the shadows, looking at what is the reality that's out there. And I've shown a good forum post here on Plato's Cave, give you a grade of 5 or 6 or so. If you include a reference, a grade of 7. If you include 2 or 3 references, 7.5, 8. And then if you show greater depth of thought, 7.5, 8, 8.5. If you show originality, you get a grade out of 10 of 8.5, 9. If you show incredible originality, sort of Nobel Prize winning originality, and that your post is so convicting that it would convert 2 or 3 people to salvation, then maybe 9, 9.5. If it would convert a whole village or city to salvation, 9.5, 9 3/4, and so on. But I'm getting off track here. My wife will be rushing in and nudging me in the rib short, saying, "You're getting off track." It's about forum posts there. So in this session, we have looked at the forum posts, and we've looked at critical thinking. Rather than take a break, since we've only got the 2 hours, is it okay if we go through there and we could finish 10 minutes earlier at the conclusion? And so I think that'll work better for us. And I'm getting nods there as well. So that's the forum posts. And over in the course, one of the things that I might have a look now, and I've written quite a bit of material on assignment 2 as well. I think it's important to recognise that assignment 2 is going to be one of your major assessment items. That is, you're going to get about 40% or so for assignment 2, and then assignment 3 is going to be a major assessment item. So I want to just spend a bit of time there. If you go to the subject outline, there's quite a bit of information about the assessment items. So I think it's important that you are fully aware of the requirements for the assessment item. And it can be worth reading through the subject outline, what's being covered, and even every few weeks, have a quick read through what we're covering each week, what we're seeking to communicate, what the outcomes are that we're aiming for each week, what the aims are in terms of development of qualities and character, what our strategies are. And then there's a list of what will be covered each week. And so intro to thinking skills in the first week. And then we're on to Greek and Christian ways of understanding truth. And then we're on to scientific thinking, and then language and emotion and other ways of knowing. And these also then become fields of knowledge in science and maths and the humanities. We're asking you to keep a personal journal, and I encourage you to write in the first person and think more deeply about how you own what you are learning and reading. We expect that this subject will challenge you to think about your thinking and how you know and what you know. And our thinking will encourage us to become academic and scholarly, but at the same time, we don't want to lose our capacity to be real, to be ourselves. And we want you to reflect on the nature of academic thinking, but the nature of being true and real and well-rounded as well. So the journal can be a great place to reflect on that. And when things don't go well, that's a great opportunity for you, a learning opportunity. And we can encourage the students on that. And you'll keep an e-folio. So if you find a great article each week, then make a copy of that. You might make a list of resources that you find and how you can use them. One of the major things we're starting to work on now is Forum Post 1, and then next week we've got Forum Post 2, which is on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So that needs to be completed by Sunday. So you need to do that. And you can even look up the original material on that from Plato in his book, The Republic. And then after that, we have a look at the way words change lives, and then science. And then we meet in a fortnight's time for this same meeting. But I want to briefly focus now on the minor essay, which is worth about half your grades, and then the major essay worth the other half of the grades. The essay begins with a quote. And so in this quote, you're told that truth is something that's never arrived at easily, but only by struggle. And then you have the statement, it can only be found by those who live the truth. And that's one of the things we're wanting to emphasize in this course in a Christian college and Christian schools. Truth is not just a head knowledge statement. And this was the Apostle Paul's concern in 1 Corinthians. Truth is not just an ability to state what is academically true. It is the capacity to live out the truth. And you could write a whole paragraph on what it means to live out the truth. I think the great thinkers through history said that truth is something that's lived out. And Socrates, he said that it's so important to live out the truth that when he was offered the choice of simply following the tradition of the people in Athens and denying his personal views on education and questioning, or drinking hemlock and dying, he chose to drink the poison and die. And Jesus too chose to go to the cross and die rather than simply give in. And the Apostle Paul chose to go into jail and suffer there rather than simply give in to the Pharisees of the time. And Martin Luther chose to go on trial and possibly be burnt at the stake. And Huss was burnt at the stake for standing up for truth. And Gandhi was shot for standing up for the truth. And Martin Luther King was shot for standing up for the truth. And Abraham Lincoln shot for standing up for the truth. So standing up for truth is costly, but it's one of the core ideas that you might want to explore. One of the challenges in any essay is to identify what is the one core theme. So you have to identify here what is the one core idea that this essay is about. And it's about Peter Vardy's claim that about truth and what is truth. So that's the one core idea. What is true? What is truth? And then within that one core idea is 3 or 4 other core central ideas. And because you're teacher education students, one of the issues that we're really looking at here is the question of why is truth important in a classroom? What is truth in a classroom? And if you're teaching spelling, or if you're teaching mathematics, why is truth important in literature? Why is truth important in mathematics? People's lives are on the line for the way things are worded in literature. People's lives are on the line for the way things are, way numbers are given in mathematics. So truth is very, very important. So that's one of the key thoughts here. And that's what Peter Vardy is touching on. I always encourage you to try and do a bit of resource and research on these sorts of issues. So Peter Vardy, try and find a bit of background, education, truth, research. So a quick search could in fact bring up some information about Peter Vardy. And so there could be 2 or 3 Peter Vardys, but it's likely that Peter Vardy could be a British theologian who's written these books and taught in England. And then if we go down to some of the books, it looks like this is the Peter Vardy, and these are the books that he's written on if it is true and about truth. So try and find some background about Peter Vardy, and he visits Australia on a number of occasions there. So there's always a danger, as I say, that you could find the wrong Peter Vardy. And then you may find good resources about Peter Vardy by going to Google Scholar and putting into Google Scholar or the Alpha Crucis library resources. And you can find here his book, The Puzzle of God, can be, see a little bit there. And then you've got other material as well about Peter Vardy. So that's all available to you. So a bit of background information. I'm just panicking here because my computer has said that it's out of battery and that you're all about to disappear off the screen. And it's now saying we're plugged in and we've got power. So these things happen. When you're teaching, you often have these things that happen and you've got to pretend nothing's happening and you plow on and your students don't notice what is happening. I was teaching once a mathematics class and I moved the blackboard and the speaker on top of the blackboard fell down and hit me on the head, but it bounced off fortunately, and I continued teaching mathematics, and the students in the front row of the classroom started to grow. More and more, and I didn't realise that there was a cut in my head, and I didn't realise that when you cut your head, it bleeds quite profusely, and so there was sort of red blood flowing down. So anyway, if these things happen, don't let the students know that your computer is out of power and the disaster is upon you. Press on regardless is the secret. So now I've not done that, and that's why I've totally lost my place and I don't know where I'm at, but bing, I'm back. So Peter Vardy, you've got some great articles here. So sometimes you can quickly get a resource like this article that he has written. Because it says it's in a scholarly journal, New Horizons in Education, volume 112, 2005. That's reasonably recent. It'd be nicer if it was less than 10 years. That looks very good. And then if I go to the end of the resource, we're hoping there's footnotes. So my eyes light up with joy as a scholar. I'm quite impressed by the footnotes. And then at the end, we see that there's a list of scholarly resources. So this is the sort of thing that you could save. You could just save the website address up the top, or you could save the whole article, and it gives you an idea. Values education for interfaith understanding, intercultural understanding. This is a resource you could use in assignment 3, because assignment 3 is on intercultural understanding. And then he quotes some other resources. So that's an example of a resource that we found. Good and Bad Religion. That sounds like a terrific resource. Being Fully Human. So Peter Vardy's got many of these other very valuable resources that you could follow there. So just encourage you, it's worth doing a very quick exploration. We've just taken less than 5 minutes to look at other writing by Peter Vardy. We're interested in the book that he wrote in 1999. So if you can locate which book it is, then that's good. And then you have to reflect on your own personal worldview. So each person sees the world in a particular way through a particular set of lenses, a worldview, and that's shaped by your upbringing and your community. But we also have larger lenses and worldviews, just like telescopes and microscopes. We can see the bigger world. And these larger worldviews, one is history. Because you can read the history of the last 2,000 years of Western society and more globally, you have access to a huge, wide understanding of the world. You also have a worldview that is shaped by your own personal experience. So don't let other people tell you what to think and believe if your experience is different to that. I've just had a student at the moment who's doing a doctoral study, and one of the things that he's done is collected interviews, and the interviews, he says, show results that are entirely different to what people are saying and claiming. And I said, that's great. That's an opportunity to examine why are they experiencing things differently to what is commonly said. That's new discovery. That makes great work. So if your personal worldview is different, then begin to explore why it is different and look at the key forces that shape your understanding of truth. And each one of you will have a different personality. Each one of you will have different interests. And it's important to recognize that you are valuable. Your interests are valuable. They're unique. Your background is valuable and unique. So that's all terrific there. So consider the different ways of knowing. And we're emphasizing here 2 major ways of knowing. One major way of knowing is the scientific. Aristotle. Observe it, measure it, describe it, evidence-based. If you're in a hospital, someone looks ill, we want as much evidence as possible before Dr. Bridget Larry makes a decision, or if she's in a classroom, Bridget, the teacher, makes a decision. We want it evidence-based. So it's what you observe, not what. So that's one way of knowing. But the other way of knowing is your inner experience, intuitively. You might sense God saying to you, look, people are saying this is the dumb student, the low IQ student, apologies for the word DUMB, and this is the brighter student. So Bridget, how do you balance these 2 different ways of knowing? The scientific, analytical way of knowing, and then other ways of knowing. Thoughts on that, Bridget?
My thoughts on that. Wow, I think that's a big question, first of all, of knowing. I think we all have our own opinion of what, the definition of knowing. We all have our own opinions in that world. But I guess for me, I probably have to think about it more so than trying to, I like when you said before, not taking on board what other people said and then making it who I am, but actually thinking about it and processing it and believing and standing in what I know.
So good. And so taking time to process ways of knowing, I think, is a brilliant observation. Marissa, what are your thoughts on how you balance the scientific? Because I think in a classroom, when a parent comes along, when the head teacher, principal comes along, if you've got evidence-based and you can say, this student misbehaved this many times, they did this, and you've got records that you've kept, but at the same time, there are more spiritual ways of knowing as well. So we've got accurate observation and records that we keep, and that's so very, very important, and that's the scientific evidence-based. But at the same time, holistically, as a Christian, we may have read in the Bible something that inspires us that this student can do better. We may intuitively have a sixth sense that this student could do better, that there's something going on in their home life and their family life. Marissa, how do we balance the different ways of knowing?
I think you were accidentally helping me answer half of that, because I was going to say, the thing is, we need to balance those record keeping, and this is the behavior that happened at this time, and then after lunch this happened, but we also sort of have to think about the history of the student. You know, not every kid comes to school each day with the exact same starting point, and you know what's happened in their historical emotional backpack kind of thing. You have to take that into consideration as well, and their behavior that day might just relate to their morning that day, and every other day maybe they're a grade A perfect student, they do everything you ask the very first time, and then that sort of will come back to maybe intuitively too. You might know that this is out of the ordinary for this student. So yeah, you have to draw on all of those different ways of knowing when you address something, I think.
And as has been posted on the chat, being in tune with your students' well-being, that is keeping a level emotion yourself as a teacher, and getting on side, building a history with the students that shows you support them, you're with them. All of that can be helpful as well. And again, as Karen said, Plato reminds us that what is unseen can be more important than what is seen. So their behaviour in a moment, what we observe and write down, is possibly just a shadow of what's going on at home, what's going on in their background, what's going on in their emotions, what's their personality, whether they have ADHD, or there's all sorts of things, chemicals that are going on. So we need to be aware of the others around them, the social setting and the environment that's contributing as well, and how they're reacting. So that's very, very important. Leonie, do you have thoughts on how you balance the scene that you record, and how you balance that with the less visible, the unseen?
It's actually really hard, especially if you look at kids that are capable and that come from a good home, and then you get students that have mental disabilities, or just come from a bad home. So that's difficult to weigh up, but record keeping is extremely important. But as everyone else said, also the emotional side, so that you can see what effects their background has to what they're doing. But there's more truth behind what we see.
Yeah, so well said. I'm reminded, hands up, anyone seen the movie King Richard on the Williams sisters? So tennis players, and so two coloured tennis girls, Venus Williams and Serena Williams, but they came from a poor background, and so they didn't have anywhere to practice and play tennis, etc. But their father believed in them and told them they could be great, and they went on to become quite outstanding. But it's a father who took time to see what was behind. So many things can be less visible there. And in this essay, number 2, we want you to think about your own personal worldview. So you're actually taking your worldview into the classroom, and in your personal journal, it's worth reflecting on what's your religious background. And so my religious background, partly brought up in an Anglican church, had friends who went to Catholic, so I've been long to Catholic, and yet I've got others keener on the guitars and the drums of the Pentecostal. And so I saw both sides, and I was a chaplain in schools, and so I saw the more traditional approach to Christian faith, and then I saw the more dynamic approach to Christian faith. And so that's part of my worldview, is that I value both tradition and Bible, but I also see great value in those who have a experiential and personal experience of their faith as well, and I recognise the diversity. And so that's part of my personal worldview. I also did a science degree, and so I was told that when you observe animals, so I looked at animal behaviour, and I was told that you had to be very scientific. You weren't allowed to describe a snake as having personality. And we observed one very greedy snake who would just chomp, chomp, chomp through rats and then kill more rats, and white rats, and wouldn't eat them. And it just seemed to me he was a very greedy snake. And I was told by my professor, you cannot write down emotional words like greedy. He was just a snake who liked to chomp a lot of rats, And so I think I enjoyed when I did more studies in the humanities and literature, where I was allowed to write about greedy snakes and monstrous animals. I think literature was a lot more fun than the scientific approach to things. But I've done both. I've done science and done humanities. I've painted pictures, written poems, and then I've also done scientific study and theological study and philosophical study. So there's a place for both, isn't there? And we wrestle with that here in Ways of Knowing. And your personalities of your students in the classroom. We could do a whole look at personality, and I think personality studies. So if we went to Google Scholar, so Scholar Google, and we looked at personality differences, personality studies, education, class, room, we could see that there's all of these different personality types in the classroom, and we need to appreciate some will be like us. And I could ask all the extroverts to put up your hands, and I could ask all the introverts to put up your hands, although I should ask that more gently because they will be cautious about that. And then so we've all got different personalities, and in the classroom you've got different personalities. But in this assignment, we're asking you to write about your personality, to gain some understanding about your personality and how it fits into the classroom. I could ask about how many of my students here today, how many of you are the super organised? It has to be organised to the nth degree. All right, so we've got some like Tiffany. So Tiffany, do you want to describe, how does that influence your approach to teaching and life, being a super organised person? And then there'll be others of us, Tiffany, that may not identify as much with that. But yeah, your thoughts, Tiffany?
So I've got 3 young children.
Yes.
And I find that it is both a blessing and a curse that I am super organised. I am very prone to being early. I will be half an hour early to something we don't need to be at. So that is a good thing because I'm there, but a bad thing because me and my 3 children are sitting in the car for half an hour waiting for our appointment. But it's hard as coming to a teacher. It's going to be hard for me to let things flow in the classroom and not stay on a time schedule or before recess we're going to get this done. Well, maybe we won't. So that's going to be a challenge that I'm going to face, to let the children flow on their own learning journey.
Yeah, and I think schools will love you, Tiffany, and parents will love the organisation. I must admit, I think teachers who are super organised do so well because that is very valued. Someone, who else wants to speak from the other side of the coin? Arts teachers and others. Hannah, what are your thoughts on your experience in the classroom as someone who identifies with the creatives rather than the super organised? Yeah.
I struggle to be super organised, which is what I'm working on myself, is to actually be able to, because we have a program, I work in the prep, so I'm with 3 to 5s, we have a program, we all have lessons to teach each week, but we kind of look at the roster on the day. So I'm working at myself to be organised, to look at it beforehand and have everything organised so I can teach and extend in what we're teaching. But I'm also kind of the one who will happily follow the track of, one of our little kids came and said, why is there a rainbow in the bathroom? And the rainbow had come in and hit our window and it reflected all over the floor. So we went and we did research on rainbows and we learned about rainbows and why it was in the bathroom, kind of thing. So
yes,
it's kind of, I like both sides of it.
Yeah, and there will be socially outgoing teachers and there will be quieter teachers, and there's a place for both. I think it's very challenging if there are people in schools and in the administration of schools who say we want more of this type of teacher or that type of teacher. So it's very true, as Karen says, we need to be adaptive with at times we need to be highly organised, and at times we need to be open to the diversity. And you can reflect about that a little bit in assignment 2. You can reflect about that in your journal, where I think you could dig deeper. What's it mean for me to have my particular personality to be teaching in these schools? What will be the challenges I face? And having reflected on that in your personal journal, you can then do some Google Scholar research on that and library research with Alpha Crucis on that. And then you can bring that across into what you write in assignment 2. Very briefly, you might cut that down and say, being aware of personality differences in the classroom. And then you could say, Scholar so-and-so has said that there are these 8 models of personality, and that you quote that scholar and quote what they say about these different models of personality and how we understand personality differences. And so you've got to work with the shy students and the outgoing students. You've got to work with the students who are more graphically oriented and those who are more verbally oriented. So there's lots of diversity there, and that's going to be part of assignment 2. Very valuable assignment 2, I think. And even as we do our weekly forums, we can be thinking about assignment 2 and how these things will apply, because you'll get grading for assignment 2. You're also asked to look at the syllabus documents, and it's suggested that you look at the ACARA or NESA syllabus documents. But if you're in South Africa or in other states of Australia, Western Australia, you might want to look at other syllabus documents that are more relevant to the school you're at, more relevant to the age group that you're working at. So I encourage you to look at syllabus documents that state the educational frameworks and how this fits with Vardy's comment. We're about truth. We're about developing students' capacity to understand truth and what truth means. So it's a big essay question, essay 2, but it includes some wonderful elements that reflect on the classroom, reflect on your personality and on your worldview, how you see the world. One of the challenges I face is that I'm a little bit Christian and I have a little bit of faith in God and Jesus. And occasionally I've taught in secular schools, and they've said, how will you go about your teaching in the secular school? And I've said, all my emphasis will be to a large extent on ethics and character. So I've tried to find a middle ground that will appeal to the secularists. At one stage, I went into one school and I had the Buddhist teacher come up to me afterwards, who was heavily into Buddhism, who said, Sam, loved what you said, character and ethics and God and Jesus, loved it. We Buddhists are with you. We're praying for you. And I thought, that's great. And I had someone from a traditional Christian church come up to me as a teacher in the school and said, Sam, we are very concerned, very worried having you. I've got the Christians against me and I've got the Buddhists for me. So, and so for me, part of my journaling is over Christian faith and what's it mean in my teaching, and to be able to teach whereby half of my students also have Christian faith, but there will be some of my students who come from an atheist background and some from an agnostic background and different viewpoints. So I've got to work through in a classroom, how as a teacher do I cater for the diversity that's there? I have a heavy interest in science and a heavy interest in the arts and poetry and music and art. But what happens if I've got boys in my class who their whole world revolves around sport? And I've got one child related to me at the moment who's heavily into cricket. And their parents drive him to a cricket match on a Saturday, and about 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning, he goes out and stands in the cricket field while other people go out and bat and bowl and that sort of thing. And then the parents come back and pick him up 8 or 10 hours later, having stood in the cricket field for 8 or 10 hours. And they tell me, you've got to get excited about this, Sam. And I play tennis with him. I think at least tennis, something's moving. Cricket, the pigeons and the seagulls are moving, but yes. But anyway, I've got to overcome these weaknesses and biases I have, and I've got to value the sports students in my class. So I say that to say, be aware of your personality, your interests in assignment 2, journal about it. Be aware of the big, big, deep questions. What is truth? How we wrestle with truth, how we teach what is truth. Do some research on how you teach it there. All right, so let's go through. Can I ask you to either write down a question now or to raise a question regarding what we're studying, and then let's go through and my brother used to make daisy chains for his 4-hour cricket game. Going on there. All right, let's start with Marisia. Questions that we have which can relate to big questions and also relate to our assignments and what we are studying and doing. Marisia.
Maybe if I unmute myself first, that might be helpful. Just in regards to the minor essay, the 1,500 words, I'm just sort of trying to think about breaking, how I break it down. If I've got 200 words to my intro, 200 for my conclusion, blah, blah, blah. The second part, when we look at the consequences of the different understandings on our teaching practice, and then there's a list of factors that could be considered. Could we sort of pick out 3 different things to consider from that? And sort of if we can, with reference to Nessa and Akara, if we have 3 different things, roughly sort of 200 words each, am I right?
Yes. So I'm giving you the freedom to choose the areas that you want to focus on. And you may choose one teaching practice area. So in primary school, you might choose the prep classroom. You might choose Aboriginal education.
And is
You
that
might-
referring to,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, Dr.
Yep.
Hay. Like when it says in which they relate to our specialty, our subject speciality, do you mean
Yeah.
as in just in general as a primary teacher sort of thing?
Yes, it can do that. And if you want to go into maths, science, you can go into that. If you
Okay.
want to go into the humanities. So it's open to you to choose those areas to focus on in the essay, because I found that the best essays are the most focused. And also the best essays are the ones that stir the most interest. So if I've had a student who's been an art student, graphic arts, and because they're passionately interested in the way graphic arts can be helpful and useful, I found that's been very, very valuable. They said, you know, graphics arts is often overlooked, and so they made that quite a major focus. And you could have 2 or 3 areas, but the more areas that you look into, the less focused. And they're also suggesting that you can have giftedness, you can have communication technology, you could have values education, you could have legals, you could have ethics. Classroom behaviour and management, I think we would all recognise is one of the big concerns. So you could make that your one major focus of the essay, or you could make it one of 3 major focus areas in the essay. So this then becomes, because it's a bit open-ended, becomes a challenge as to how you explore the essay. So I think you need to begin by saying, what is the one major thing that this essay is looking at? Looking at it today, I think truth, as Peter Vardy describes it, seems to be a major thing. Worldview, how we view the world, and the teacher's personal worldview appears to be another major area that's being looked at. And then there can be others. If you read it on 2 or 3 different days, you might get 2 or 3 different insights. So I do encourage you to reread the question over a few days to get a feel. But we want a well-developed, stimulating, interesting essay that resonates with the big questions that you are asking in this subject. How do we think? How do our students think? How do we critically think, scientifically think, but at the same time recognizing there are other ways of thinking, spiritual ways of thinking, intuitive ways of thinking, artistic, musical, poetic ways of thinking. All of those are equally important. And so we want you to think through, what is it that you think is going to be really valuable for you to understand during this study for essay 2? And the challenge is, you'll go to Google Scholar or to Alpha Crucis Library and you'll find some resources. I think the essay will be built around 1, 2 or 3 or 4 major scholarly resources on teaching and education as it relates to critical thinking, thinking truth. And then there'll be other resources, but you have to be careful. A rabbit warren or a rabbit track could lead you down to things that aren't related. If you decided art was your passion of interest, and then you wrote about Vincent van Gogh, then you're way off track. If art's
Would it
your
be-
interest, yeah.
Would it
Yeah.
be too sort of, I'm sort of thinking that one essay might be able to almost help the other in a sense.
Yes.
Like if I was to focus on, say, pedagogical practice, and maybe, and like classroom behavior or whatever, and then sort of dive into, like, say, the 8 ways pedagogy, and Indigenous worldviews and things like that, and having to take that into consideration. But I'm saying that, but I also understand that those sort of same themes I would be visiting in the major project. Is that like kind of frowned upon, or?
No, that's good. I think that is fine. Remember, know that more than about 5% from one assignment can go over
I won't
into the
just cut
second
and
one.
paste, don't worry.
Yeah, yeah, that's
But
right.
it's just
That's right.
that
We don't want to
those-
photocopy
yeah.
of the second for the third. And similar with your other subjects you're looking at. In this subject, you are encouraged to explore things not examined in the other subjects, but certainly what you're saying about pedagogy and pedagogical practice and behaviour, you can bring ideas across, but you should bring across ideas that aren't fully explored in the other subjects that you are interested in, that you find there is space in this subject to explore spirituality, ways of knowing, philosophy. This is a subject where you can explore some of those areas that are touched on in others, and so on. So if Piaget is thoroughly covered in another subject, don't spend too long here, but you may include a paragraph on Piaget. If Bloom's taxonomy is thoroughly covered in another subject, we probably won't mention Bloom's taxonomy in this subject so much because it's going to be covered in other subjects. So don't spend too long on Bloom's in this subject unless it's absolutely needed. But a good point. Look at the major project now, particularly where it says you've got to look at 2 Indigenous groups. This is so interesting, the way Australian Aboriginal people engage with knowing. And it would be fascinating to look at going walkabout as a way of knowing. I mean, people look down upon going walkabout, and yet going walkabout can be a way of knowing. Bridget, do you see value in walkabout as a valuable way of knowing? It's
Yeah, I do. See,
wow.
going for a walk or walkabout, like you said, of knowing it, actually it's a spiritual thing and a connection to country. For an Indigenous person, it actually brings you back to your roots and the generations that's gone before. They've left an imprint on who you are, but also just going for that walkabout and connecting to the country, it also brings a truth to who you are as well.
Wow, that is so good for me. I'm wondering what I'm doing. I'm in France, and I'm planning in a week's time to go walkabout where my great-grandparents, etc., went walkabout in London. And so what you've said then really resonates with knowing where some of my people have walked. And
that's amazing. You would,
yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. So again, I think that's a great insight that can come into contrasting Indigenous groups. One of the real challenges will be the second Indigenous group. Bridget, do you have any thoughts? I guess Torres Strait Islands one easy one to choose. Maori, we have less Maori in our classes, Papua New Guinea, and then some have chosen American Indian. Do you have any, Bridget, that you would choose as your second group and why that would be a good second group to choose?
For me, even though my husband is Torres Strait, I think I would choose Torres Strait Islanders only because my family growing up, I didn't and it's totally not my mum and dad's fault or my grandparents, but I didn't really get the inside of the connection to country and a lot of language and a lot of who I am as an Aboriginal person shown to me, and I'm still learning at this moment. But my husband's family, being Torres Strait, have a really strong connection to who they are and a strong connection to their culture, which I see as a very interesting thing because it is important, like we were saying throughout this whole Zoom, like to actually know who you are and connect to who you are. So I think I would choose Torres Strait Islanders.
Yeah, so good. And then we see here the importance of understanding language. That is If you come from one culture, your language shapes the way you see the world. And if you come from even a socio-economic cultural group in one suburb of your city, or you come from another cultural economic group in your city that talk classical music and talk other language, then you're going to have different viewpoints. Language shapes the way we see our world. And that comes into your third assignment, language shaping our way of knowing. And again, you've got questions like behavioural management style. So if we understand the background of our native people, and if we understand the background of different socioeconomic groups, then that's going to be very useful. And then you've got the self-understanding, which is what assignment 2 is such a lot about, is understanding yourself as a teacher, and then understanding development and growth. There's a number of things you could include there. Amy Lou and then Libby, do you have questions that you would ask? Amy first, do you have a question?
No, I actually don't.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then Libby. And then
I had a couple of general questions.
Yeah.
Are the weekly class videos that you posted, are they different than our these sessions here?
Yes, they are. So the weekly class videos go into more depth, whereas these sessions here will include more tutorial discussion. So the way they have been defined is in terms of the depth that is covered. And so in these 2-hour sessions, they're called tutorials, in terms of we're wanting to encourage greater participation, whereas the ones that have been posted up, and there'll be at least 2 posted for every week from last semester, the focus, they were called lectures, and the focus was on delivering 80% lecture and having 20% discussion, whereas our 2-hour sessions are focused more on 60-70% discussion and 20% lecture, in that you have more flexibility then to go to the previous videos for each week. And you'll see sometimes the opportunity to look at 2 different videos. One was taken last semester on the Monday early in the week. One was taken on the Thursday later in the week. So sometimes the Thursday later in the week is more developed and a bit more academic. Sometimes the Monday is a bit more chatty and introductory, but you could have a look at the differences and see how you like those. So you should watch at least 2 hours of videos for each week. At the same time, we have covered some of the material in our intensive. So the idea of the intensive, which wasn't the case for last semester, is that gave a chance to go deeper. You'll find the discussion of the hats. Debbie, who's the guy who does the hats that De Bono's hats. So De Bono and his hats we've not covered so far. That's in one of the class videos that you may see there. Further questions, Libby?
Thanks for that. In the assignments, the essays, are the quotes included in that, or is it just the forum post where it's not included?
Just the forum post material, not the quotes and not the references in the
essays.
And similar with the essays, not the references, not the quotes, only the actual writing of your own words. The most valuable words that are marked are your own words. That is, quotations don't necessarily show your thinking, and the references tell us how many people you've engaged with and the quality of the people you've engaged with. And generally, the more references you have, the higher grade you get. But it is the quality of the references and the depth of your engagement with the references. And it is also graded highly on your ability to focus on one major coherent key point that is carried from the beginning of the essay to the end of the essay, that's introduced well at the beginning and concluded well at the end. For that reason, it's often worth writing a dummy introduction at the beginning and a dummy conclusion, and then going back, reading through your essay and rewriting the introduction after you've done most of your essay, and rewriting the conclusion so that it concludes ideas made in all of the essay. And you do that at the end of all of your work, because often you find things in your research that are quite different to what you expect when you started. Yeah. Further questions?
Dr. Sam, I have a question.
Yeah.
Excuse me, just going back to the discussion threads, the ones in the subject guide are different to the ones that are actually on Moodle?
Yes, so the Moodle ones in some ways supersede the subject guide ones. So the subject guide ones are from 18 months ago, whereas the Moodle ones are more recent. At the same time, the subject guide ones are more the official way in which the government accredits us. And so if you want to look at the official government guidelines, you'll see that that is drawn up when we begin teaching a subject like this, which would be 2 or 3 or more years back. And then every 5 years when we reaccredit, we redraw up the subject guidelines. And then as we teach over 3 or 4 years, we begin to say, hey, this is a better resource. This is a better resource. Yeah. Yeah. So further questions that students may have, Leonie, and then Hannah.
I have a couple of questions. The first one, would it be acceptable to write an outline for our essays? Is it required?
Yes, yes. So you've got both my emails. Please also use dr.sam@gmail.com, as well as the Alpha Crucis ones. I look at the Alpha Crucis ones every few days, but I look at the dr_1 and it's going to, there we go, drsamhay@gmail.com. I see that every day. Yeah. Further questions, Leonie? That's it.
Abstracts. Do we have to write an abstract for assessments?
You certainly don't have to write one, but it can look good. And the same with a cover page. A cover page with a nice amount of information on it can lift an essay. Yeah. Normally you wouldn't use footnotes, but again, if you want special permission to use footnotes, you could ask for that. Yeah.
Okay. And then my last question is, would you still like me to write on Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal groups, even though I'm not familiar with them?
No, you can choose any Indigenous group. The guidelines tell us that you need to choose one of the two groups as an Australian Aboriginal group, but certainly your second group could be a South African group. I guess I'm open a little bit if you very much wanted to do another South African group, but the guidelines do say that it should be an Australian group, and the other one certainly can be a South African group. Would you choose Zulu or something?
I would have liked to choose the Xhosa group that's here.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so that would be good. Actually, if you wanted to send me some emails and put forward an argument for 3 groups, so if you wanted to have 1 Australian Aboriginal group and 2 South African groups, then I could work with that as well. That would cover the guidelines, I think. Yeah. Other questions? Hannah? Yep. And if others need to leave, then sure. Yep.
So one of my questions was about the abstract, if you needed them for them. And then with regards to Leonie's question before, talking about an outline, do you want us to email you the outline? Is that what she meant? Or do we just do our own self-outlining for ourselves?
Yeah, so it's optional. So you can send an outline, you can send a proposal, and you can also send a draft. So all of those are optional. And if you chose that option to email those to me, that may improve your writing skills and it may improve your grade. It can be very beneficial if you're writing a lot in the first person, as a student yesterday was, and then we suggest that you write that first person material in your journal and that in your essay you write in the third person. And so those sorts of guidelines can really help a student to do well. So sometimes you can learn more by sending something like that before you hand your essay in rather than getting feedback after your essay. But at the same time, then after the essay is fine as well. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I just never heard of it before, so I thought I'd check.
Yeah. So thank you, each one. I look forward 2 weeks' time to catching up again. And thank you for all that you're doing and for all that you're doing with preparing for teaching and in your teaching. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy your trip.
Thank you.
Thank you.